So let's see how some of these alliances look. The first is an example of complementers meeting to address a competitive threat. In the mid 2000s, when the cable companies were launching their triple play, you can get your cable TV, your home phone, and your internet service from us. AT&T was caught without a competitive response. So they partnered with Yahoo to help them with the portal end, and that frankly died out relatively quickly, and then added first Dish, and they later then replaced Dish with DirecTV, so that you would go to AT&T and they can say, well, sure, we can do all of that. We've got your phone line, we've got your internet, and we have this deal with cable, or I'm sorry, with satellite TV, so you get the same thing. Obviously, in some markets now, those alliances are unnecessary because AT&T has U-verse where it has its own triple play. The next one is an alliance that they wish you've heard of, although in class I'm going to be interested to see how many of you have. This is an example of a network alliance. ShopRunner has over 80 participating companies. They hope it to be over 100. And this is where various companies have tried to join forces in the ShopRunner Alliance, which is a standalone company, to try to meet the threat of Amazon Prime. And so you have companies such as Blue Nile, the jeweler we talked about in class, Toys R Us, GNC, Brooks Brothers, AutoZone, ESPN.com if you buy apparel, a lot of the NFL, NBA.coms. They all join in this, and for an annual fee, you get free 2-day shipping, just like Amazon Prime. The next alliance is an example of complementers cooperating, trying to gain market entry. AgustaWestland is an Italian helicopter manufacturer. Lockheed Martin is a very large U.S. defense contractor who does not do anything in the helicopter space. They created this alliance to bid to build the new helicopter that the Marines would buy, and those variants of those helicopters would be used to fly the President of the United States, aka Marine One. The President has never flown on anything other than a Sikorsky, which is a U.S. manufactured product. So AgustaWestland said, without some sort of a U.S. face, we've got no chance in this competition. So they partnered with Lockheed Martin, and the entry was called the US 101. Its final assembly would be in the United States. Lockheed Martin would do a lot of the detailed system integration, such as the communication suite and defensive suites on the helicopter, so that they could call it a U.S. helicopter. And it won. It actually beat out Sikorsky. Now, the program got canceled a few years ago due to cost overruns that frankly weren't the company's fault. But they won. And they won strictly because AgustaWestland partnered with a U.S. company. Sony and the Sony-Samsung JV is an example of competitors joining together. And this is where Sony was actually the junior partner and had to acknowledge that Samsung had the better glass making capability for flat screen TVs. So they entered into a joint venture, built some factories in Korea, expanded them, and it was all about building glass for the front screens of the big screen TVs. It was a successful alliance, but as the demand for new flat screen TVs began to diminish, it was disestablished, and the plants, I think, were sold off because they just didn't need the capacity. The airline alliances are another great example of a network alliance. So you have, for example, the Star Alliance in oneworld, where you think you booked on one airline and you go to the airport and you see that you're getting on another airline's aircraft, and that's because they've got a partnership, and you show as being on your airline's flight, but you're really not. You're on one of their partners' flight. An example of this would be, say you fly from Atlanta to Paris on Delta, and then from Paris to Milan on an Air France flight, because they're in the same alliance network. And incidentally, that Paris to Milan flight, it's on your ticket a Delta flight number. You're getting Delta frequent flyer miles, but in reality, it's an all Air France operation. So this allows the airlines to expand the markets that they can serve. It also, in a few select cases, allows them to have a presence somewhere without having a ground staff. So, for example, I don't know whether this is the case, perhaps British Airways is able to maintain a small presence at the Dallas-Fort Worth network, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, that maybe American Airlines, their alliance partner, actually provides the ground staff to support the airplanes and get them back in the air. Microsoft Yahoo, another example of horizontal, two competitors, both in the search engine business, both getting clobbered by Microsoft, who come together to basically try to bulk up. So now if you're a marketeer looking to place search ads, you don't have to decide whether you're going to put it on Microsoft or Yahoo. You can go to one place and sell ads on both. The next one is an example that sometimes alliances don't work. General Electric, I think everybody's heard of. Tatoon, I think it's safe to say few, if any of you have heard of them. Several years ago, GE, which once upon a time produced television sets but hadn't for many years, was approached by Tatoon, who wanted to get into the big screen TV business, and they basically said, we would like to license your name so that when our TVs hit the US market, they are branded GE and people go, oh, I know GE. For whatever reason, this didn't work very well because when I recently searched, there are no GE TV sets for sale anymore. And then my example of a vertical alliance is the 787 alliance, where you have Boeing, the end assembler, the big guy that goes to Spirit Aerosystems, which builds a lot of the fuselage, Fuji Heavy Industries in Japan, which builds a lot of the wing sections, and lots of other parts that come out of Europe, for example. And you see the motivation for this. The development costs for a new airplane, particularly one that was so cutting edge in its composite construction, is very expensive. And by going out with an alliance, they were able to spread the developmental costs and the developmental risks across many of these partners. But there are risks. Chief among them is that the research says 50 to 70% of alliances end in failure. Here's the tricky part. What constitutes failure in an alliance? And here's why that's a little bit sticky. Let's say one party walks away very unhappy, but the other party is pretty happy. Well, is that a failure? Hard to say. Certainly not from the perspective of one of the entities. It's only when both of them walk away unhappy that you can say it truly was a failure. So what do we know about why they tend to fail? One is proper work is not done up front, which is to say that you have not done sufficient due diligence to A, draw up a proper agreement, B, understand what core competencies are really involved, and C, what the people are really going to be capable of and what they're willing to commit to. Then you get into it and you think that you can manage these cultural differences, and even though it's not a complete overlap, the cultural differences are still so hard that the frustration level grows and it's not perceived as a success. Then you get into a little bit more of the less benevolent perspectives. And that is, one is they have the resources that you think the alliance needs to go forward and they're just simply not willing to share them. Or they don't have any intention to extend this alliance for long term because their strategic intent is to learn whatever they can and get entry to wherever they need, and then they're going to move on. A great example of that is one that's happening today in China. Several years ago, Airbus agreed to begin production of some of its A320s, which is their top selling airplane. It's the equivalent of a Boeing 737 that Southwest flies, so a very common airplane. They're actually producing them in China. Why is Airbus doing that? Because they want to sell more A320s in China, and they think that having them be produced there will cause the national government to look more favorably on Airbus products and require the airplanes to buy them. But why is China participating? China is very explicit that they want to develop their own airframe manufacturer such that it will rival Boeing and Airbus. So you're like, Airbus, what are you thinking here? You're training your own rival? And in a surprising amount of candor, I read an article where the Airbus executive said, yeah, we understand what they're doing, and here's what we're doing. We are keeping the really good manufacturing secrets and processes in a little black box that only Airbus employees that are not Chinese natives, nationals I should say, are working in the plants in China. So we think we're protecting the really good stuff. The stuff around the edge, the Chinese are happy to learn it. They don't know it, but long term, this stuff is going to become obsolete because what we have in that core is going to replace it. and we'll be on to the next thing, and they'll never catch up to us. So both sides know what the strategic intent is. Airbus fully expects to be kicked out sooner rather than later, but in the interim, they hope that they sell a lot of product. And this raises an interesting question. Is conflict a good thing or a bad thing in an alliance? And of course, our gut reaction is, ooh, that's a bad thing because conflict's a bad thing. But I read an interesting article once where a senior executive said, you know, if my people aren't coming to me periodically complaining about just how pushy and demanding our alliance partners are and how they've got the best end of the deal, then I worry that we're getting the worst end of the deal and we're just not smart enough to figure that out. So some people say a level of conflict that is manageable is actually healthy for an alliance, and it's likely that both sides are getting closer to an equal deal if there is some degree of conflict. So given that these alliance risks are present, what do? It's going to sound a lot like dating somebody before you marry them. You pick wisely. You ensure that where they want to go and their strategic goals match yours. And more fundamentally, you ask yourself this question: why is that company willing to partner with me? What do they want to get out of this deal? And then you have to be good with it. I told you the Chinese are there or invited Airbus in to learn about their manufacturing processes. Airbus is there to sell airplanes. They're both good with it. They know it's likely not a long-term relationship. It's not likely to quote unquote end well, but they're fine. You want to have contracts that are sufficient to the task, and the reason that's important is put things down in writing when everybody's happy, so that when everybody's not happy, you have some contractual arrangements where you can go back and say, you agreed to do this, and they go, yeah, I did. Okay, I get your point. But you don't want the contract so ironclad that they can't morph as new opportunities emerge. And then you have to build a climate of trust within that alliance. Former President Ronald Reagan was famous for saying trust but verify, which is where you want to have performance metrics so that everybody can say, yep, we're doing what we said we would do. A good way to jumpstart trust in alliances is to allow them to become increasingly complex over time, but also build in a little bit of reciprocity and a little bit of, if you will, both showing each other a little bit of leg early in the process so that you gain some trust and that you start off on a positive basis. And lastly, very much like a marriage, you have to commit to the relationship. And in business, you do that a couple of ways. You commit money. That would be creating a joint venture or putting equity into the deal. The research shows alliances tend to go better when both sides have money in the game. And with your human resources, who do you send to work in this alliance integration function? Do you send your rising superstars that you're trying to give a new training to, new experience to, a new leadership test to? Or do you send your Johnny or Jill peaked and being eased out of bigger jobs because they can't handle them? And the results of that are going to be pretty obvious. So what you want to do to make good alliances is evolve them to increasingly bigger deals, pursue opportunities when they present themselves, make sure that there's a strong business case that's established up front, and extend them for a period of time. The best alliances are going to last for a while. So in summary, alliances are hot, but they have risks. And let me put a real point on the risks that you take in an alliance. Boeing and its alliances with its vertical partners in the 787 development pushed out a lot of financial risk in that they pushed development costs and responsibilities onto their partners. But what they sacrificed was a lot of control. And in the end, that airplane was 3 years late coming to market. And Airbus with its A350 was able to make a lot more market inroads than it would have been able to. So alliances did good things for Boeing, but it cost them dearly. Our next topic is going to be global. I'm going to pause, get a drink of water. Join me soon.